I want to give a special shout out to all my patrons, my Bibliospran, Bibliohowlers, and Bibliomancers. Thank you so much for supporting my hobby and passion even more. It means so much to me. Hi everyone, Petrik here. Because recently I just finished reading Of War and Ruin by Ryan Cahill, and I got plenty of questions regarding whether they should read the series or not. I thought I might as well do a spoiler-free review for Of War and Ruin / why you should read or should not read the Bound and the Broken series so far. So this is kinda like a series so far review video while talking about the escalation from the beginning of the series leading to Of War and Ruin, the mid-season finale of the Bound and the Broken series by Ryan Cahill. And in my opinion, Of War and Ruin is Cahill's golden ticket to the Hall of Fame of the fantasy greats. This mid-season finale to the Bound and the Broken series is 430,000 words of glorious epic fantasy. Yes, at 1,481 pages, that's the Kindle page count, and 430,000 words long, Ryan Cahill has created one of the biggest fantasy novel that I've read. Just for perspectives and comparison here, Of War and Ruin is slightly bigger than A Storm of Swords or A Dance with Dragons by George R. Martin. It is also bigger than The Way of Kings or Words of Radiance by Brandon Sanderson. And does the book earn its page count? Yes, I think it does. Sure, there were a few sections that I think could be trimmed down. I think doing that would have tightened the pacing further. But on the grander scheme of things, I don't think this is a big deal. I mean, I mentioned the same thing for Rhythm of War by Brandon Sanderson, the fourth book in the Stormlight Archive, and I still consider that book a masterpiece despite it. And Of War and Ruin is a phenomenal epic fantasy, no doubt about it. It gets crazier and more awesome when you think about how Ryan Cahill actually edit and published this book in the span of 1 year. Of Darkness and Light was published on the last day of 2021. And then the novella, The Exile, was published on May 2022. And the third book in the series, Of War and Ruin, was published recently on the 19th of January this year. So in approximately 1 year, Ryan Cahill published 2 big novels and 1 novella. It's an insanely fast output considering just how awesome Of War and Ruin is. I think this is the best book in the series so far. Of War and Ruin is the third out of 5 books in the Bound and the Broken series by Ryan Cahill, similar to how Of Darkness and Light seamlessly continue from where Of Blood and Fire ended. The story in Of War and Ruin continue after what happened at the end of the previous book. There are not enough words in a single review to fully explain how much Cahill has improved again in his writing craft since his previous book. Of Darkness and Light was already a huge improvement over Of Blood and Fire, but it is still tame compared to how much Of War and Ruin improved the quality of this series. As the title says, war and destruction rampage across Etheria, and in terms of scope, world building, writing, and characterizations, Of War and Ruin is undoubtedly Cahill's best storytelling in the series to date. You know that feeling when you read an epic fantasy series and you're amazed at how the author tracked every piece of the series while providing momentous revelations to the hints planted since the beginning of the series? That exactly is what happened in Of War and Ruin. Main point of view characters were spread out to different locations in Etheria, progressing each respective story, conflict, and developments tied to one another. Expect satisfying convergence with this book and you will get what you want. I never expected The Bound and the Broken would reach this grand proportion. Not this soon anyway. Of Blood and Fire was alright. It's a good book but nothing special about it. It started simple, tame, and comfortably, especially to those who love reading classic epic fantasy. Of Blood and Fire is essentially a smorgasbord of classic fantasy mashed into one book. But just for comparison here, in this book, Of War and Ruin, Ryan Cahill has blown the entire Echo Saga by Philip C. Quaintrell out of the water, and I love the Echo Saga. It is another Dragon Rider epic fantasy series that I recently read and enjoyed. But with Of War and Ruin, I can certainly say that The Bound and the Broken is a superior series, whether we're talking about the quality and the scope of the world building. We have reached a state in the series where none of the novellas are skippable now. For example, The Fall. The Fall is a prequel novella to the entire The Bound and the Broken series, and I think in many other series, a prequel novella like The Fall would exist to serve only as a comprehensive account of what happened in the lore of the main books. And for a while, it was truly the case in The Bound and the Broken series, until Of War and Ruin entered the equation and that notion is no longer applicable. The event in The Fall played a major part in the world building and the history of the series. And in Of War and Ruin, Ruin, it is even more evident just how integral it is to the entire narrative. The shadow of the past is the echo of things to come. Then there is also the second novella, The Exile, where we learn more about the House Artyris, Dane, Belina, and several other things I cannot mention here due to spoilers. Belina did not even become a memorable character, to me anyway, until I read The Exile. No kidding, my brain could not register her permanently back then. Things changed after reading The Exile. I mentioned how much I loved Dane as a character plenty of times. He appeared for the first time in Of Darkness and Light, and since then, he instantly became my favorite character in the series. Even more so after I finished reading The Exile, and now extensively more after reading Of War and Ruin. This is impressive because Dane, comparatively, does not have as many POV chapters as Callan and a few other main characters. But bloody damn, what an appetizing and badass character he is. I cannot get enough of reading badass and virtuous reluctant heroes. Danes fit the bills. His actions and attitudes were inspiring to me. The iconic leadership and actions he unleashed in this book were utterly outstanding. There was one scene in Of War and Ruin where Dane made me raise my fist to the air. It was too good, legendary, and rewarding. Those who have read Of War and Ruin will know what I'm talking about here. But I am getting ahead of myself here. I will share my thoughts regarding the characters and characterizations of the series soon. My point is this: offering additional depth to the many characters in the series aside, these novellas help flesh out the web of intrigues and complexities that Ryan Cahill has planned for the entire series since the beginning of Blood and Fire. And of course, it goes without saying that you have to read the previous two main books first in the Bound and the Broken series. Some of you might think that this is obvious, but well, people, you know. The thing is, Cahill is an author that keeps getting better and better with each book. I gave Of Blood and Fire, if I remember correctly, it was a 3.5 out of 5 stars, or maybe a 4 out of 5 stars. But I gave Of Darkness and Light a 4.5 stars. And Of War and Ruin will be the first time I gave a 5 stars to the main books in the series. This is a novel that delivers emotional payoff. And without reading the previous books first, you won't reap that reward. Of War and Ruin starts a bit slowly. The first quarter of the novel exists for readers to reacquaint back with the story and emotions of the characters first, and I totally appreciate this. After that, everything gradually rises and reaches a devastating crimson and fiery crescendo. As I stated, Of War and Ruin is the mid-season finale to The Bound and the Broken, and it offers many explosive payoffs to the series so far. The payoffs for all the seeds and breadcrumbs, whether you spotted them or not, planted since the beginning of the series, is here. All the previous novels and novellas work as a crucial foundation for Of War and Ruin. At the same time, the revelations revealed in this novel closed and provided new questions to be answered in the next 2 books. Cahill has demonstrated his increasing skill as a storyteller and world builder in Of War and Ruin. And the intricacies and interconnected factions, plotlines, and character relationships I read here are often emulated by the best fantasy authors. For the first time in the series, I feel like Of War and Ruin is the book where I finally felt engrossed in every POV character. This wasn't the case in Of Blood and Fire and Of Darkness and Light, not on my first read. Don't get me wrong here, I loved Of Darkness and Light. But it was crystal clear I love reading Callan and Dane's POV the most in that book. Well, I guess I can still the same for Dane here, but I equally enjoy reading all the other POV characters now. I wish I could get into the details of why each POV character was so superbly written, but hey, this review is long enough already and it will be even longer if I talk about them in details. I do not think it is a good idea for me to dive into all the well-developed characters in the series here. There are just so many important characters in the series now. Callan, Dan, Rhys, Ella, Dane, Alina, Eltoar, Farda, Kalinvar, Dallin, Aeson, Therin, just to mention a few. And they all capture my attention and immersion in Of War and Ruin. Reading these flawed characters trying to survive and fight for their loved ones was compelling. Honestly, I cannot even think of an epic fantasy book where the characters cried or shed a tear as much as the characters in Of War and Ruin. Loyalty, betrayal, friendship, vengeance, responsibilities, family, love, faith, and devotion are some of the main themes of the book and series. One of my favorite things about Cahill's multiple POV chapters is the way he handled perspectives from protagonists and supposed antagonists. I actually don't know why this comparatively hasn't been done as frequently as I hoped. I think it should almost be a staple in epic fantasy with multiple POV characters to write the POV of the villain too. Some of the best fantasy authors like Brandon Sanderson, Fonda Lee, Ken Liu, Steven Erikson, George Martin, John Gwynne, Joe Abercrombie, Michael J. Sullivan, and more have done this in their books. And they often resulted in incredible tension-packed and heart-wrenching character dynamics. Cahill showcased how great he was at this with Farda in Of Darkness and Light, and he elevated it to a greater extent in Of War and Ruin with Eltoar and other characters from opposite sides. This is not a grimdark fantasy series, but I love feeling conflicted about the protagonist and antagonist in this book and series. At times, it almost felt like these were just characters standing on opposite groups, manipulated and forced by dire circumstances instead of them firmly branded as enemies. Sure, there was unforgivable evil like Randall, but the rest, there were layers to their actions and motivations. However, knowing about this doesn't mean I agree with the villains and what they did. This is just to emphasize how intertwined the complexities of the relationships are now. Protagonists like Aeson can be hateable. God, I hate Aeson. He is one of the most selfish and manipulative protagonists I've read. And antagonists like Farda can be likable. Even if you want to forgive each other, how do you even contemplate mercy when vile actions have been accomplished in the past, no matter the reasons? How do you break the chains of hatred? This is virtually asked throughout this series. When armies go to war, hundreds die. Thousands, tens of thousands. Blood spilled only to feed the soil. Bodies return to earth. Those who are victorious return home, hailed as heroes, champions of their people. But to those whose loved ones were slaughtered, they are murderers, despicable people who should be cast into the void. It's not so black and white, is it? This world we live in. Before I end this review, it is safe to say that Of War and Ruin is the darkest, most violent, and most heart-pounding installment of the series so far. There were some heartbreaking and bloody scenes in the novel. Civilians and innocents were tortured mercilessly, and atrocious deeds were selfishly executed in the name of honor, religion, love, and justice. The all-consuming madness of the Burned Lands was terrifying, and the inevitable confrontations of elemental and draconic disasters were magnificently implemented. Dragon-bound by fire, broken by death. The stakes of the Bound and the Broken series increased vastly in Of War and Ruin. It is hard for me to imagine epic fantasy readers not liking the Bound and the Broken, especially if they reach Of War and Ruin. On top of empathizing characters plus immersive and intricate world building, there was a myriad of elements that would click with many fantasy readers. If you want the feeling of being inside a shield wall as introduced in Of War and Ruin, you will get it here. If you love dragon riders, animal companions, and the heartfelt relationship between humans and them, you will also get it here. How about honorable immortal magical knights with soul blades that could cleave their victim's soul, or powerful portrayals of elemental magic and druid? If you want to read an epic classic fantasy series written in a modern voice with vivid battle scenes and all of these elements attached, The Bound and the Broken is for you. I think this series might not work for you if you want something that has less classic fantasy elements. For example, if you truly do not want to see elves, dwarves, and dragons in your fantasy books, then yeah, there is a really good chance you won't like The Bound and the Broken. And also, if you want a fantasy series with low magical usage, then again, The Bound and the Broken might not be for you. And lastly, do not expect purple prose in this series. I think the way Ryan Cahill writes and tells his stories is similar to John Gwynne. Just to give you an idea of the kind of prose that you're getting with the series. Classic epic fantasy helped shape The Bound and the Broken, and in return, Of War and Ruin and The Bound and the Broken has established Ryan Cahill as one of the authors who will be responsible for fanning the embers of classic epic fantasy in the future. As I said, this is the first 5 out of 5 stars rating I gave to the main books in the series. The Bound and the Broken is a fantasy series imbued with classic fantasy elements, heart and intensity, laugh out loud moments thanks to then, well-written characters, engaging battle scenes, and meticulous world building. I cheered, I laughed, and I gritted my teeth. I was absolutely hooked by the narrative that Cahill has crafted in Of War and Ruin. We are halfway through the series now, and I am genuinely excited more than ever to read the remaining books in the series. I know there is always the possibility of the remaining of the series failing to live up to our expectations, but I do not think that will happen. If you haven't read this series yet and you are a reader who loves the things I mentioned in this review, do not hesitate, do not contemplate Ryan Cahill. He has admirable dedication to constantly improving his writing craft. I am confident the rest of the series will fulfill our high expectations and epic fantasy craving. I totally loved Of War and Ruin on my first read, and my instinct says I will love it more on my reread. So yeah, read the Bound and the Broken series, and in the meantime, I will wait with bated breath for the release of the fourth book in the series of Empires and Dust. Riz always found there was something bittersweet about finishing a book. The sense of achievement and joy was often tarnished by the realization that he could never read it the same way again. He could, of course, start from page 1 and read through to the end, but it wouldn't be the same. His preconceptions and notions were irrevocably altered by the first read. It was simply the way of things. So that's the end of today's video. That's my thoughts on Of War and Ruin and the Bound and the Broken series so far. Do let me know whether you have started reading this series or not, and if you have, do you like reading it? Let me know your thoughts on the series, and if you feel lukewarm about the first book of Blood and Fire, I highly recommend you to still continue at least to Of Darkness and Light. I think the second book is a huge improvement over the first book, and if by that book you still don't like reading the series, then drop reading the series. I think the rest of the series won't be for you. But I really hope and think if you love classic epic fantasy written with a modern voice, I think you will love reading The Bound and the Broken as much as I did. Anyway, let me know your thoughts on the series. Let me know your thoughts on Of War and Ruin if you have read and finished the book. And if you haven't started reading the series yet, please let me know whether you plan to in the future or not. As always, thank you so much for watching, and thank you for your support. Bye bye. Lastly, I want to say thank you so much once again to all my patrons who keep on supporting me.